One night after work, I was bartending at a nice martini bar, and my coworkers, who were really my only friends at the time, kept insisting I join them for a night out. At first, I resisted, but eventually I caved. There was a DJ at a nearby bar, so I figured I'd go for one drink and then head home. But, as it often goes, one drink turned into two, and before I knew it, this guy walked in, let's call him Jake, with a group of people, some of whom I vaguely recognized from around town. Jake was fun, charming, and we spent the night dancing and laughing together. It was my first casual fling, but the very next morning Jake called, and we started seeing each other regularly. Jake's cousin Joe lived just down the road from me, and Jake was practically living there too. Since I was fully embracing the single life at that point, I started hanging out with him all the time, sometimes even spending the night. A couple of months into it, I realized I had fallen hard for Jake. I told him how I felt, and he had been telling me from the start that he was divorced. Since we never talked about it much with the group, I believed him without question. The night I confessed my feelings, Jake had other plans and wasn't around. Neither was Sally, Joe's girlfriend, who I had been getting closer to. So I ended up hanging out with Joe and a few of their friends who were in town visiting. We went to a local bar, and unfortunately, I had too much to drink. In my drunken state, I started venting to Joe about how I was falling for Jake, but he kept brushing it off, saying, "You guys are just having fun, don't take it too seriously." Eventually, we made our way back to Joe's house, and I was feeling sick and out of sorts. I retreated to the bedroom where Jake and I had often stayed and ended up in the bathroom, where I passed out after getting sick. I woke up later in bed, only to find Joe taking advantage of my vulnerability. At first, I couldn't fully process what was happening, but when I did, I pushed him off and told him to stop. Thankfully, he did. I was in shock, trying to explain that I loved Jake and that Sally was my friend, so I didn't want this to happen. Joe sheepishly left the room, but I was left feeling violated and confused. In my mind, I was spiraling with guilt and self-doubt. Did I do something to make him think this was okay? Was this somehow my fault? What if Jake finds out? Will he believe me or side with his cousin? Will this ruin everything? These are the thoughts that many victims grapple with, convincing themselves to hide the truth to avoid even more chaos. I couldn't go back to sleep, so I left the house while it was still dark, walked home, and took a long shower, my mind racing the whole time. Later that morning, Jake called to pick me up, and I was still trying to process everything. I wanted to tell him what had happened, but I was terrified of what his reaction might be. I was worried he wouldn't believe me, or that it would create an irreparable rift between him and his cousin. As we were driving, Jake dropped a bombshell of his own. He wasn't actually divorced. He told me he was separated and in the process of getting a divorce, which was why he wanted to keep things between us low-key until everything was finalized. I was shocked but tried to play it cool, saying I understood. But in that moment, knowing he had lied to me, I realized I couldn't trust him with the truth about what happened with Joe. I decided to bury it and let my feelings simmer down. Just 2 days later, on a Tuesday, I found out I was pregnant, 6 weeks along. I was completely taken aback but told Jake, making it clear that I was capable of handling it on my own if he didn't want to be involved. To my surprise, he was thrilled. He told me he had always wanted to be a father and was ready to step up. I was relieved, but my relief was short-lived. The very next day, Jake came over with more bad news. Not only was he not separated, but he was still fully involved in his marriage. His wife had found out about me and the baby, and after some pleading on her part, he had agreed to stay with her. I was heartbroken and furious. I couldn't understand how Jake's friends had supported this behavior and why no one had ever warned me about his marital status. I felt utterly betrayed, not just by Jake, but by everyone in his circle. These were my only friends at the time, and I had no one else to turn to. Despite everything, I still loved Jake, and we had a child together, so I tried to make it work. But the anger and resentment lingered, especially since I had been kept in the dark for so long. Over the next few years, I raised our son, worked, and continued my schooling. But I never got over the fact that no one had told me the truth about Jake's marriage. I was made out to be the bad guy in the situation, even though I had been completely blindsided. This group of people had become my only social circle, and I was stuck trying to prove my worth, falling into the trap of people-pleasing. If I ever wanted things to work with Jake, I had to find a way to cope with all the buried hurt. My relationship with Jake remained turbulent. I put up with far too much back then, but I loved him deeply and wanted a family. Despite everything, I saw the good in him. He had overcome a rough childhood marked by neglect and abuse, and I believed he could continue to grow with the right support. I made excuses for him, rationalizing his behavior by considering his past traumas. Eventually, Jake did get a divorce and moved out of his wife's house. He got his own place for a while, and after a couple of years, when our son was about 2, Jake moved in with me. Although I had tried to bury my anger and resentment, those feelings never fully disappeared. The unresolved tension would resurface now and then, usually sparked by Joe, who still played a big role in Jake's life. Joe would often provoke me, sometimes subtly, sometimes more blatantly. Whether it was criticizing my parenting or making comments about Jake's hobbies or my music career, I was in a band. He knew how to get under my skin. These constant jabs caused friction between Jake and me, as he always seemed to defend Joe. I understood their bond. Jake and Joe had grown up in a difficult environment with no one but each other to rely on, but it was hard to continuously make exceptions for Joe's behavior. 6 years into our relationship, Jake and I had another son. Despite all the difficulties, I still held on to hope that things would get better, that we could build the family I had always dreamed of. But the weight of the past, both what Jake had done and what I had hidden, was never far from the surface. The unresolved issues from how our relationship started, along with the unjustified and hurtful behavior I endured, finally came to a breaking point. Jake and I went through a separation, during which we both underwent extensive counseling. Thankfully, we managed to repair our relationship and rebuild our family. However, we distanced ourselves significantly from certain friends, especially Joe and Sally. Though I remained polite when I encountered them, their presence deeply affected me, leaving me irritable for the rest of the day, sometimes even picking fights with Jake because just seeing them stirred up so much frustration. A few months ago, after another uncomfortable run-in with them, I reached my limit. During yet another argument about Joe, Jake finally asked me, "You always say he's not a good person. What do you know that I don't?" That was the moment I broke down and told him the truth, the real reason for my long-standing resentment. I revealed that 12 years ago, Joe had violated me while I was passed out in his daughter's bed. As I expected, Jake was livid and ready to confront him. He said he believed me immediately because, having known Joe his entire life, he understood what he was capable of. He admitted he had seen Joe do some terrible things, like cheating on his ex-wives and even on Sally. When Jake confronted Joe over the phone, I listened as Joe denied everything, calling me a lying asterisk, and hurling other insults at me. When I spoke up to defend myself, Joe mocked me and threatened that no matter what I said, he'd always be in Jake's life, and I wouldn't come between him and my children. He made it clear he wanted nothing to do with me ever again, but his arrogance revealed how little accountability he had. Jake was devastated. I could see his entire world shifting as he processed this betrayal. But he stayed by my side, and after a long night of talking, he said something that finally made me feel safe. "I'm so sorry I wasn't a better man back then, that you didn't feel safe enough to tell me what happened. I should have been there for you. I'm better now, and I will always keep trying to be better." In that moment, I felt true safety for the first time in our relationship. Jake needed time to mourn the loss of a lifelong friendship, but his love for me remained strong. Even though he was hurt, I hadn't told him sooner. But how could I have? I didn't feel safe enough to share the truth until now, after all the counseling and growth we'd gone through. Our relationship was never stable enough before, and I couldn't risk the fallout. I also knew I needed to tell Sally, not because I wanted to rekindle our friendship. I had no desire for that, but because it was the right thing to do. So I wrote her a long email explaining everything, including the truth about Joe. I sent it a few weeks ago, and though I know she read it, she forwarded it to Joe, who called Jake in a panic. She never responded to me directly. Instead, I saw a post on Instagram a few nights later of her surrounded by her real friends, drinking wine, with a caption about how her heart was full again. I'm certain it was a passive dig at me, sent through people who shared it with me. But I've made peace with it. I didn't tell Sally to hurt her. I had nothing to gain from doing so. The only thing I had to lose was my self-respect if I stayed silent any longer, and I refused to allow that. On my healing journey, I've committed to rejecting the toxic loyalty these people had to each other. Covering up for one another's wrongdoings, regardless of who gets hurt, is childish, disgusting, and deeply harmful. I had endured it for over a decade, and it nearly broke me. I'm done with it now. My therapist helped me realize that coming forward was necessary, even if it risked my relationship with Jake. I knew there was a chance he might choose his bond with Joe over me and our family, but I also knew I was strong enough to take care of myself and our boys no matter what. I apologized to Jake for not telling him sooner, but as my therapist said, no one has the right to dictate when, how, or to whom a survivor shares their story. I thought I was protecting Jake and everyone else by keeping silent, but I was wrong. There were times when I made excuses for Joe, focusing on the better aspects of his personality, which made it easier to tolerate him. But the assault remained like a low hum in the background of my mind for over a decade. It took me years to realize that protecting people who hurt others is not my responsibility. I'm done participating in that toxic cycle. So, am I wrong for revealing the truth after all this time, knowing it could destroy my husband's lifelong friendship? Should I have continued keeping it to myself? It hurts that Sally didn't believe me or reach out with questions, but that just shows how far she'll go to maintain the illusion of her happy relationship. I'm no longer hiding the truth. I've let go of the weight of keeping these secrets, and I'm ready to move forward, free from the lies, toxic people, and generational trauma that I refuse to pass down to my sons.